In September 1758, a baby was born to Catherine Suckling and her husband Edmund Nelson, the rector of the town of Burnham Thorpe near the Norfolk coast. The sixth of 11th children, nobody could have known that this sickly little boy would go on to be lionized by the British nation. For this baby had a name that would go on to be synonymous with tales of heroism and feats of arms at sea. That name? Horatio Nelson. Tonight, the hugely popular naval historian Kate Jamieson returns for the first installment of our multi-parter on the life of Britain's most famous sailor. We talk about Nelson's early life, why few were less obviously destined for greatness, how he managed to wrangle his way up the greasy pole of naval promotions in an age of patronage, and yes, we'll be talking about the controversies as well, not least that contentious question of his views on slavery. This is Horatio Nelson, The Early Years, up next on the Napoleonic Wars pod. Hello and welcome back to the Napoleonic Wars pod, where we are finally covering one of the most hotly anticipated topics this podcast has failed to address to date. We are talking Nelson, and not just in a sort of fleeting, let's do half an hour on the guy kind of way. We are deep diving and rabbit holing the hell out of the man. This one is dedicated exclusively to the early years, and who better to talk us through it all than the brilliant master gunner of naval history, Kate Jamieson, who is returning. Kate, how are you doing?
I'm very well, thank you. Although I feel like the dog is probably Master Gunner.
This is
I'll
true.
I'll take Admiral of the Fleet, honestly. I'm quite humble, much like Nelson.
Are you sure that's enough for you? Just
I
mere
think
Admiral of the Fleet?
if I
Don't
get a
need,
good hat, then I'm okay with it. Yeah.
don't need First Sea Lord Jameson? I mean, that has a ring to it.
Does have a ring to it, doesn't it? Yeah. Maybe let's go with that. And then I'll just wear a cool hat. Perfect.
Okay. Welcome to the Napoleonic Wars pod. We are joined by First Lord of the Admiralty, Kate Jameson. Um, yes. I mean, of all the people who are known for their love of Nelson, you are probably top of the list on this one, right? So you were an obvious pick. Um,
Although you
before
said
we
that, when I went on Mastermind, Nelson was obviously my topic when I was 21, and I came last because I had a complete meltdown at having a camera shoved in my face, which is quite funny given how often I now have a camera shoved in my face with no problems.
there's a certain irony to that. Yes, I'd forgotten that you'd done Mastermind for a
Yeah,
minute
apparently
there.
somebody this week actually had Nelson as their topic. I haven't watched it yet, but I guess enough time has passed since 2012 that they felt that they could cover him again.
Interesting. Okay. Were you ever tempted to go back on and attempt to redo it?
No. Despite going on TV a few times since, I Mastermind is a different beast. It's not an enjoyable experience.
See, my general knowledge isn't good enough. I wouldn't be able to
Oh, my
hack
general
it.
knowledge is appalling, absolutely appalling. I think that was my problem for the most part.
So why Nelson for you? I know we should kind of go and talk about the guy himself, but it's one of the things that we've never actually discussed, and I suspect people will be curious if you're inclined to share about why Nelson was the fixation for you.
Fixation is a good word. I went on HMS Victory when I was about 8 because my parents took us to the dockyard for the day. And I can't remember. I've still got the book somewhere, although I've got so many books that I can't see it because it's a very thin one. They bought me a book all about Nelson, along with one of the sort of HMS Victory guidebooks. And it wasn't very big. It was a very, very thin book with lots of pictures and object photos of objects and that kind of thing. And for some reason, I was obsessed with it. So here we now are. I guess, I don't know, you should take kids to historical places because it spurs interests, is the takeaway from this one, I think.
Yeah, too right. I mean, I've said many times it started with Sharp. I'm reading Sharp's Trafalgar, which is the best one. Don't argue with me, people.
And it needs to
Um,
be an episode, arguably.
it does, but they couldn't be able to do it properly because they'd get Ridley Scott to do it. No, I said I wouldn't talk about Ridley Scott. Bad
Every
sack.
time.
But then that was coupled with a trip to Victory. I was 13, so I was comparatively a late developer. Um, but I stayed with the Sharp series, which is why I went all kind of army land based dark side. And well, I don't know if you'd claim that the Navy is the dark side or the light side. Perhaps that's a discussion for another show. Shall we talk about Nelson, considering that's what we're here to do? Um, Family. We'll start with that risk sounding like an episode of EastEnders, isn't it? Keep it in the family. That was an attempt at an East End London accent. People who were wondering if I had a fit. No, that was just a hate crime against Cockney. Um, we'll start with the Nelson family. What sort of family is he born into? When? Well, we know the when. September 1758. But
Mhm.
what are his prospects? Because he's what, the sixth of 11.
Sixth of
Um,
11, yeah.
so he's not even a second
Hey, I can't
son.
imagine dealing with 11 children. But yeah, so he's the sixth. They actually did have a second son who they did name Horatio, but unfortunately died in infancy. So um,
So he's Horatio the second.
I guess technically, yeah. They actually had even this Nelson, they had him baptized when he was about 10 days old because he was so weak that they basically didn't think he would even make his christening in November. So yeah, his father was obviously the rector, and some of his other family members were farmers, but Nelson had quite a strong Christian faith, I guess, because of his upbringing. And if you look at the records in the church at Burnham Thorpe, actually, they show that he helped his father quite a lot in the church. Um, and actually, in later years, he made sure that most religion sort of was publicly practiced on his ships. He had public services of thanksgiving after his victories. Didn't really mention Jesus. Mostly addressed all of his what's the word I want? Sermons. I'm not a very religious person. Sermons, I guess, to God, which I'll come back to later because obviously he made his peace with God with Emma Hamilton later in life, and there's a great story about that. But we will that's getting ahead of ourselves a little bit, I think. Um, his mother, Catherine Suckling, had actually brought the family quite a few useful connections. So her grandmother was the sister of Sir Robert Walpole, which was George II's prime minister. And the name Horatio actually came from Horatio's second Lord Walpole, who actually became Nelson's godfather. So a fairly well-connected family. And it was actually Robert Walpole that launched Catherine's brother Maurice's naval career, who we'll obviously chat about later. Um, and his great uncle had actually fought against the French and was the treasurer of Greenwich Hospital. So there's quite a lot of naval connections in the family, which, is probably where we think Nelson might have ended up. Um, his options really were, going off and joining the army, which depended on buying a commission and was a bit embarrassing for people that didn't have much money and they didn't have a lot of money. Um, the law, I guess, but that also included having money. Apprenticeships with lawyers cost money. Going into the church meant university, which cost money. But obviously, he then went off to join the Navy, which I will chat about in a minute. But you could do that without needing to sort of already have a strong foundation and lots of pennies.
I'm just gonna let you continue in your flow.
Sorry, I'll just ramble on forever about Nelson.
Hey, do it. This is the Napoleonic Wars pod. Rambling about like Napoleonic nerdery is what we do. And this is the sort of Nelsonian nerdery corner of that thing, technical term. Um, so lots of naval connections, obviously. I seem to remember reading somewhere a very sort of idealized account of Nelson's life, which probably wasn't grounded in a lot of history, and it was a long time ago since I read it, that used to bang on about sort of Nelson wandering the dunes and always being drawn to the sea and all of those kinds of things. Did he really have much of an inclination or an obvious kind of drawing to the sea? Was he kind of I don't know anything about the local economy there. Was he like talking to fishermen and going, "Oi, what's it like out on the waves?" Or was it just that, look, here's a career for you, Sonny, have at it?
I mean, I think most of it came down to the fact that he was in Norfolk and very close to the North Sea, so he was able to kind of go out and can't imagine there was much going on in Norfolk at that point in time for young kids other than to go and watch interesting things happening outside of their village. I mean, it's a very pretty village that Nelson grew up in with a great pub, uh, but there's not a lot going on there for young people. So um, supposedly, as you say, Nelson spent a lot of time at the coast, looking out into the North Sea and watching all the ships going in and out with, I don't know, oysters or whatever it was, mussels, oysters. Um, but I don't think at that point he particularly had an inclination to join the Navy. Um, it's really when they sort of started speaking to his uncle, who was a captain in the Royal Navy at that point in time, that he really learned about it, I guess, in the to the extent that he was actually interested.
At what point does he start going off to sea? Because you talk about how he's kind of helping his dad in
Mm,
the church. He's one of 11. Okay, some of those aren't surviving infancy, but nonetheless, this is a big family. Is there
mhm.
a sort of an inclination to look like off you go? Thank you very much. We love you lots, but you need to like not be in the household. We need to not be feeding you because we've only got a finite salary and lots of mouths to feed. Is he kind of pushed early, I guess is my question,
And
or is
not
it kind of he sits around and eventually they're like, right, we need to get you a career now.
not yeah, so not super early. He did obviously go off to school. Um, And there's a story actually that probably is worth mentioning here that kind of ties into the idea of Nelson's, duty and actually there's a couple of stories, duty and courage and whatnot. And supposedly there was a story when he and his older brothers went bird nesting when they were visiting his grandmother. I think that's stealing birds' nests. I'm not 100% sure, but I'm fairly certain that's what it means. And he didn't come back for dinner. They went and found him and he was underneath a hedge. And I think his grandmother basically said, "Oh, did fear not drive you home?" And he said, "No, I never saw fear." Um, Now I'm not sure how much you want to believe that. He's under 10 at this point in time, but it's a nice story. I don't think there were any actual witnesses that said it had happened, so I'm not particularly sure where it came from. But I think after Nelson died, there were actually a lot of people kind of exaggerating how they knew him and the stories about him. There's also a really great story about how he and his brother had to go to school in the snow. Uh, and their father left it to their kind of I don't know what the word I want is, decision, really left it up to them to decide whether they could make it or not. And his brother said, "Oh, it's snowing, we should just turn around and go home." And Nelson said, "No, it's been left to our honor to decide whether we can get to school. We must persist." Now, if he was my brother, he probably would have had something lobbed at his head at that point in time because snow day, probably not quite the same back then, but yeah, supposedly he pushed on to get to school even though it was really deep snow, and he was quite intelligent. There's, I think, a few documents that say that he kind of was fairly intelligent, wrote a lot of letters, enjoyed school, but wasn't, a particularly standout academic necessarily. Um, and his uncle, as I said, at this point is captain in the Royal Navy. He was unemployed after the 7 Years' War, but he basically used to spend all of his time telling his nephews all these wonderful stories of what he got up to. Um, and then I think it was 1770, he basically got given a new command because there was a bit of a dispute between Britain and Spain over some islands in the South Atlantic, the Falklands. I wonder whether that will ever happen again. Anyway, he offered to take one of his nephews with him off to sea, and Nelson at this point was pretty keen to go. I think he was 12 at this point. Um, and as I said, there was the kind of, with the Navy, you didn't have to have all of that money. You could make a name for yourself, you could gain prize money, you could join a ship, and all of your promotion really depended on you knowing the ropes. That's not me doing that intentionally, but knowing the ropes, knowing how the ship worked, everything. And it depended on, actually knowing what you're doing and I guess a little bit of influence rather than on money. You would learn a huge amount, a huge amount. And really, all his father would then have to pay for was his uniform and a chest, which, in the grand scheme of things, if you're looking at it in comparison to anything else, is relatively decent. So yeah, the next year he went off to sea with uncle on HMS Raisonnable.
I do believe you tried to guide us towards a Top Gear moment there, in terms of the Falkland Islands and courting controversy with my massive 0. Well, less than 0.1% of listenership, originating from Argentina. I don't think that this is going to suddenly sort of explode.
I think they'll know
Um,
what the Islands are. We could call it Las Malvinas if they need if they want the balance there, I guess. It's
or we could call them the Falkland Islands, because like the inhabitants don't want to become part of Argentina. It is that simple. Um, we should probably move on, shouldn't we? But yeah, no. Um,
yeah, Nelson goes off with his uncle essentially, and sort of starts his training, realizes that he gets horribly seasick, which isn't great and does plague him for pretty much the entirety of his career. There's
sorry,
actually
what?
sorry.
He gets seasick.
Oh, Nelson suffered from seasick awfully, absolutely terribly. Um, there was a what did he say? It put him confoundedly out of good humor or something. Um, and I think he quite often used it as a means of sort of showing how patriotic he was later in life, because he said that, nothing but his love for his profession kept him 1 hour at sea, which I think was very much a case of being like, look how dedicated I am, look how patriotic I am, look at the sacrifice I am making. Nelson was a very, very good PR machine, and this started very early on in his life. But yeah, we'll cover that later. But yeah, seasick, horribly, horribly seasick.
Is this perhaps a good indication of just how his options are pretty finite? That you've got a kid, and he is. Let's bear this in mind. Like he's young, I think, when he goes to sea, and at that point he doesn't know he's going to become Admiral Horatio Nelson, and he's going to have his Nelson moment, dying at Trafalgar, and become the darling of the nation. At that point, he is a young lad,
Yeah, and a
and
frail one at that. So I think his uncle actually said when they asked whether he could go off to sea, what's poor Horatio done that he should be sent to rough it at sea, but send him, and perhaps the first time we go into an action, a cannonball will knock off his head and provide for him at once. So I don't think anyone particularly had any inclination that Nelson was bound for greatness or destined for greatness.
can I just say the uncle sounds like a bit of an asshole? Like, yeah, it's
Yeah,
fine.
really, really nice to Nelson, helping him out a lot. So
Like,
um,
my nephew can come to sea with me. He'll probably get hit by a cannonball. It'll all be fine. It'll solve everybody's problems. Like, he sounds like one of those people. Do
uh-huh.
you know what I mean?
Well,
Um,
I guess so, but he does help him out a lot, really, over the years. So we'll come into that.
okay. Um, Now, his early career, I won't lie, my perception of what life is like for a recently joined officer in the Navy is basically Hornblower. Um, is that accurate? I suspect there's sort of a degree of accuracy, but what's Nelson's experience like? Particularly if he's on his uncle's ship, does he get a slightly easier transition, or actually the fact that he's there because of a connection, is that a cause for more friction with his crewmates?
I mean, Hornblower, of course, was also famously seasick at Spithead. So there we go. No, I mean, to some extent, there were some similarities in the sense that, you had your midshipmen all messing together and things like that. But um, definitely for Nelson, there was no nasty midshipman Simpson trying to cause problems. So he joined the ship while they were getting ready to make way, but nobody was actually there. So bless him, he was pacing up and down the deck apparently for a few days because he was super homesick. And then this young officer kind of took him under his wings a little bit until his uncle turned up. But yeah, he basically had to learn everything. He had to learn, being on a ship, life at sea, sleeping in a hammock instead of a bed, wearing a uniform of sorts, how ships sailed, navigation, seamanship, all of that. And like I said, I think a couple of them sort of took them under their wings a bit because he was 12, 13 at this point in time. Like he's very young and obviously still relatively frail looking because again, his uncle wasn't thinking much of him. But they didn't actually end up going to the Falklands because the argument kind of fizzled out to nothing. And then the ship was decommissioned. So his uncle moved to a different ship, which was a guard ship at the time, HMS Triumph. And then Nelson was put in there as a captain's servant, uh, which is sort of the general progression, I guess. So in theory, it's actually quite a long road, I guess, to go from joining the Navy at 12, 13 and then becoming an actual commissioned officer. You didn't really have formal qualifications, but as you alluded to earlier, it is actually quite useful to have a patron. So someone who gets you into the Navy can kind of introduce you to some people, give you a bit of an understanding of how the Navy works. Now, most of these people were sort of from the middle to upper classes at this point in time. And it took a few years, I think it was 6 years you had to serve before you could go for your lieutenant's commission, including two as either a midshipman or a master's mate. So actually, in quite a lot of the documents that I've seen when I've been researching my gunners, you see a lot of midshipmen or master's mates who then go on and become gunners because they've been in the Navy for a certain period of time and they've actually written in there that they failed their lieutenant's exam and decided that was what they wanted to do instead, which is quite interesting because I mean, a lot of people would spend pretty much their entire career as a lieutenant promotion. Once you got to that point, a lot of it came down to luck and some of it came down to how much you knew. But once you managed to make it to post captain, that was kind of where you wanted to get to because it would put you on a captain's list. And then nothing could really shift you from that. And then you would progress up through the ranks based on a kind of a seniority process. But if you wanted to get that high, you really, really had to be looking to be made post captain at a young age. Um, and Nelson pretty much relied on his uncle to sort of clear the way a little bit for him, and it worked. So yeah, you were supposed to sort of join the Navy at I think 13 if you were not the son of a naval officer. You could go to sea a little bit younger if you're the son of a naval officer. So obviously Nelson went in at 12, but his uncle rated him back as saying that he joined the ship in January rather than March, so he had an extra couple of months there to go towards that 6 years that he needed.
And just talk us through those ranks for folks like me who can't remember quite how it works. I'm familiar midshipman, lieutenant. Then I understand captain, post captain, and then you're into admirals of varying descriptions. But talk us through
You do have
that ladder.
your commanders in there as well, of course.
Whoops. Yes, I knew that probably.
There are some others in there. Um, but yeah, it really depends on the route that they wanted to take as well. So Nelson got packed off to Jamaica with one of Suckling's his uncle Maurice Suckling's friends. So whilst he was captain's servant when he was in with his uncle, he went off onto this merchant ship. I think it's called the Mary Ann, and he was then when he came back rated as an ordinary seaman. So that showed that he actually had some concept of how a ship worked by that point. And then by the time he got to 14, he was a midshipman. And actually, when you look at how he was with his midshipmen in the in the future, way in the future, he actually spoke up for them quite a lot. And I think it's because he spent so much time as one with all these young men that were of a similar kind of background, I guess. Um, that he spoke up for the midshipmen quite a lot and made the point that they were sort of deserving and needed some extra help. There was I can't remember which ship it was off the top of my head. I have to remind myself as we go through, but he actually ended up with quite a lot of junior midshipmen who hadn't really been to sea before and made the point that he really, really wanted to kind of introduce them to people and give them connections and help them out because that's what he'd had.
Okay. One of the things that struck me there was you said he's rated as ordinary seaman. That
Mhm.
that's a standard what the if you were going to use an army parlance would be a rank and file
Yeah, yeah,
sort
yeah.
of
Absolutely.
tier.
So
So
it's not a midshipman at this point.
so
So,
these guys have to kind of do an apprenticeships almost in the ranks in
well, yeah,
order to
they have
then
to know how the ship sails. So, in the sense that I mean, army officers at the time could kind of just have some money and buy a commission, but you had to have the understanding of how to sail your ship, and how to navigate a ship and how to, not ground a ship or something. And you're trying to learn what is essentially a very, very difficult career. You're 13 and essentially doing what I guess the equivalent. You've now got your warfare officers in the Royal Navy nowadays and principal warfare officers in charge of ships and things. You have to learn how to command a ship. You have to learn how to maneuver it in tide and wind and current, any storms. We've got shoals. You've got some awful coastlines and storms around the West Country and France and things. And you have to also keep an eye on all of the people that are, below you. So it takes a lot of time. And your ordinary seaman is sort of the lowest that you get because you haven't quite got enough experience. Then you'd go up to being an able seaman, which Nelson did a little bit later.
And during all of this, do they mess with your quote unquote normal sort of bods, normal crewmates, or do they have sort of you're on this trajectory towards becoming a midshipman, therefore we'll give you a nicer sort of place to berth, as it were?
So actually, there's a document about when Nelson was on board the Raisonnable, and he was in the kind of cockpit area, which would quite often be where the midshipmen were. But I think it just depended on the size of the ship, honestly.
So it's really not a kind of gilded process by any stretch of the imagination. Not only is it hard work.
Yeah, you're not walking in and going, "Oh, my uncle is the captain of this ship, so therefore I will have this nice shiny cabin over here, please." He was expected to learn, and he was actually very intelligent, and he picked up all of that work quite quickly, and apparently really enjoyed boat work. So the kind of going ashore in the smaller cutters and things. He acted as a pilot at one point, which again, you have to know what you're doing, and you have to know the waters incredibly well. So it was kind of expected of. I mean, obviously, you have a sailing master on most of the ships who is the expert of navigating that ship, um, but they still had to know how to do everything. You're not going to just be in command of a ship and have no idea how it actually works.
Okay, so it's much more of I guess, a process.
I think the Navy very much is like a meritocracy is the word, probably the best
Yeah,
word.
yeah, absolutely. Stark contrast with the army there. This is probably why the navy is perhaps better regarded in. Actually, no, I'm not sure that's true because well, it will ignore that entirely because that's rubbish. What I'm saying there. And instead we will solve my gaff by talking about polar bears,
Mhm.
which is relevant. What is it with Nelson and sort of unfortunate incidents with nature? We've got the polar bear incident. We've got him going bird nesting. Like, is he the antithesis of Chris Packham? Is that what we've got going on here? Or is there sort of something else going on? You should probably explain the context of Nelson and the polar bear as well along the way. But I'm just curious why we have these kind of stories of Nelson not really being best mates with nature.
I mean, later on in life, he does actually go off to Caicos and they find a bird. I can't remember what it's called, like a white-necked Jacobin or something. So he does, pop up with nature along the way. But yeah, the the polar bear's an interesting one. So he is serving with Captain Skeffington Lutwidge, which I think is a great name. Um, I feel like that would be the best name to bump into on HMS Carcass. And basically, this is on part of Phipps's Arctic expedition. So they're basically trying to determine how far navigation is possible towards the North Pole. Um, and as we're kind of talking about exploration, I think it's interesting also that the same month Nelson left from the Thames, Captain James Cook is coming back from his first voyage. So this is our kind of time period crossover that we've got. So his first voyage, obviously, he was observing the transit of Venus in Tahiti and then charted New Zealand and Australia. So it's an interesting crossover of that kind of time period of exploration, I guess, which isn't what we're really talking about because Nelson didn't do a lot of it, but essentially they were planning to go north. It was funded by the Royal Society, and they were kind of hoping that they would find some nice ice-free polar seas to sail through. And that didn't particularly happen, but obviously they went off anyway. Now, Nelson at this point is midshipman, and it was quite a happy ship. They had some intelligent people on board as well as naval officers. They had someone who knew how to take the salt out of the seawater. I don't you now you have a machine for that, obviously, but this chap knew what they were doing. They had a couple of whalers that they used for pilots. Um, and the Board of Longitude had given them an astronomer. They had some Harrison chronometers, and they had this thing, I can't remember the name of it, but it was basically a log that they could use to calculate the speed of the ship based on distance. So kind of speed, distance, time calculator. I can't remember what it was called. Um, and then they spoke to someone who'd actually sailed with Cook, who told them basically what they might find in terms of animals, plants, and that kind of thing. But they had pretty rubbish weather, didn't have much warm to wear. And Nelson, of course, is 14, probably wearing clothes designed for someone who's in their 30s or 40s or 50s, and probably not filling them out very well. But it was very cold. They were going through pack ice quite regularly, using poles to sort of push the ice away. But basically, the polar bear, there's a plate which shows a boy with a musket and a cutlass and a bear, and they've called it Young Nelson's attack and chase after a bear. Now, supposedly, he beat the polar bear to death using the butt of the rifle because he wanted to take the skin home of the polar bear for his father. And it's very much shown as kind of proof of Nelson's courage. But Nelson never mentioned it in his own life. And we know that Nelson was a great publicist of his own life. And even in I think it was 1796, he wrote his own little memoir type thing. And there is nothing in there about a polar bear um, at all. So they think it came from Captain Lutwidge and also the sailing master, who basically said that they saw a bear on the ice and people went towards the bear and the bear ran away. And Nelson had basically said, "Oh, I would have liked to have got the skin for my father, but came back with nothing." So it's very much kind of spiraled. And the most famous account where they're saying about him beating the polar bear with the rifle, but actually was published 3 years after his funeral. So there was no mention of it until after Nelson had died. And Nelson, as I said, was a great publicist and never even mentioned it about himself. So I don't think it actually happened purely because Nelson would have been like, look at all these things I did. I beat a polar bear. Look what I did. I'm fairly certain he would have been insufferable on social media.
Yeah, I'd certainly agree on the social media front. And as you say, Nelson was almost as good as Napoleon on kind of publicity and getting his word out there. So we would probably know the polar bear story. Okay. Curious then that it's kind of embedded itself, but I suppose it's one of those many things. It's like Wellington and his violin. Did he burn his violin? Well, no, probably not. Um, but yeah, those kind of apocryphal things. Okay, so Nelson doesn't go and shoot the polar bear or bludgeon it to death with a club.
Also,
Um,
sorry, just to interrupt, there's one more person I think probably I should mention who I haven't to do with that exploration trip is I don't know if you've come across him, is Aloda Equiano.
oh yeah.
Yeah, so he was actually serving on a ship um, as part of Phipps's expedition. He was an able seaman at this point, but he was on, I think, the racehorse rather than the carcass. So he wasn't with Nelson, but Nelson was coxswain of the ship's boats, I think. So yeah, so in just because I know that we're going to talk about slavery later, obviously quite an interesting career, an interesting chap. I think he was an abolitionist, obviously, but came from Nigeria, went off to the Caribbean, and he was actually sold to a Royal Navy officer, and then sold a couple more times. But then he managed to buy his own freedom, and I think that's quite nice. He wrote his own memoir, autobiography, etc. But he was actually on the Phipps expedition with the Navy, which I think is quite interesting.
That's very interesting. Of course, we can only speculate about the conversations the two might have had, and we'll get there later on. But yeah, for folks who aren't familiar, I'd urge you to look up Aluda Equiano. In fact, we might make an episode
Mhm.
about him in due course. But as you say, his memoir is one of the big kind of abolitionist kind of centerpieces in terms of people kind of going, oh, this is the reality of what it's like for people
Yeah,
who are enslaved.
it's really that narrative, memoir, book, whatever you want to call it, that helped secure that kind of Slave Trade Act in 1807, really.
Okay, we'll dig more into that in a bit. Um, I want to talk about what he's like as a person at this point before he starts to make a name for himself. I know we're sort of skirting around the edges of this repeatedly, aren't we, in terms of Nelson the publicist and Nelson and apocryphal stories and people sort of trying to attribute all of the inverted commas Nelsonian traits to him, like from the moment he takes his first breath. What do we actually know about him as a human at this point in time? We've talked about he's clearly intelligent. There's perhaps a sense of ambition by going and sort of doing piloting work and all the rest of it. But how much can we say about sort of the content of his character before we get to things like his first action and all of the points at which we start to sort of attribute certain characteristics to him?
Yeah, so he's obviously very enthusiastic about the Navy at this point in time. He enjoys it. He's picking up a lot of skills. He's sort of taken to it quite naturally, which is surprising for a lot of people given how he started off. But um, somebody actually said that someone described him as being stout and athletic, which is a far cry from a couple of years before. But he's got a lot of confidence. He's very knowledgeable, obviously, at this point, and he seemed to be very popular with other people on board. No one had any disagreements or fallings out with him particularly. He wasn't really disciplined. There wasn't anything particularly going on, but someone said that he had a florid countenance, which I always find quite funny, which I think florid is very elaborate and over the top a little bit, I guess. A florid countenance and ardently ambitious, which we see for, the rest of his life. So he's very much the young Nelson, I think at this point is probably the best way to describe him, knowing what we know about his later life.
Interesting. There does come a point where people seem to be sort of setting themselves in a mold. I'm very mindful of what somebody once said about my grandfather, who went on to become a senior RAF officer. And years later, somebody turned around, in fact, it was his co pilot, and said, the thing you have to understand about Harry White is that he hasn't changed a day in all the time that I've known him. Even as an aircraftman second class, he was acting like an air commodore. Uh, there's a slight sense of that with Nelson. Um,
Absolutely.
okay, first action. What's he? Where is his first action? I should know that, and I don't. So where, when, how, what, why? I guess all of the fundamental questions that need to be asked by people who are ignorant, like me, about Nelson's life. So what's he doing? How does he react? What do people say about him? Give us the full Kate Jamieson experience on Nelson's first action.
Depends what you depends what you want to call his first action. Um, Most people would say it is off India. So he joins HMS Seahorse as a midshipman. His uncle got him the post. We'll come back to the patronage. And interestingly, one of the other midshipmen he was serving with was Thomas Trowbridge, who you come across later at Cape St. Vincent, at the Nile, very much alongside Nelson. Also went on to become an admiral, did very well. And there are a few of them that you see coming through the Navy at this kind of similar time. There's Nelson, there's Trowbridge, there's Collingwood, all of these names that you see that have done well and have managed to do well, and they all have patrons, uh, which is interesting. I can't remember who. I think it was Catherine Beck, Cat Beck, that did some work on patronage in the Royal Navy, and it's absolutely fascinating. Um, she was telling me about it once, and it's just really interesting to look into it. And there's a whole book being written about one of um, Nelson's chats, which I'll come back to. But yeah, so essentially he joins HMS Seahorse. They're heading off to the East Indies, which is quite nice for Nelson, somewhere a bit different. Um, and the Seahorse basically fought a couple of armed catches. I can't remember where it was. I would probably slaughter the name of it anyway, but basically southern India. Um, and these ketches were owned by the then Sultan, essentially. And they had a few shots fired, but it wasn't particularly a major engagement by any stretch of the imagination. Nelson spent some time in Madras after, and then got sent home with malaria. So wasn't having a great time of it in the East Indies. Um, and actually, at this point in time, um, his uncle is comptroller. Is that how you say it?
Both. Both.
Yeah, of the
Dutch
Navy.
thing.
And one of those words I never really have to say out loud, so I just like, oh, don't know how to use it. But basically, he helped Nelson get a bit more promotion, and he passed his lieutenant's exam, and his uncle was indeed sat on the board. And when Nelson wrote to his brother, he said that he'd got his Master of Arts, and his brother at this point is at Christ's College in Cambridge getting his Bachelor of Arts. So I don't know whether he would have been a bit like, have you, or have you just done some boaty stuff? Um, but anyway, yeah, so then he got appointed acting lieutenant and went to head off to Gibraltar after that.
Okay. So that's his technical first action, but
Hmm.
you said there's debate. So what's the other um possible first action, or the one that sort of feels more, yes, okay, this is Nelson, doing something bigger. Do we have a sort of secondary example?
We do, but I think it's probably best to talk through his career to kind of get to
Ooh,
it, just because
okay.
there's a lot that happens in between
Hmm.
um, that
Okay.
probably needs to be covered before we get there, if that makes sense.
Well, that's me told.
Sorry.
So
No,
no, that's
I'm
fine.
not trying to shut you down. It's just that there's so much that happens in between the two that suddenly you skip ahead and then you miss this whole gigantic section of Nelson life.
So this
Um,
is a lovely exercise in why sometimes it's important to just stick to the questions that we'd agreed and discussed beforehand. Um, so let's talk about the career then, because it feels like it's not massively eventful, and I'm, admittedly, I'm kind of saying that with an eye on the later career, right? Your Cape St. Vincent's, your Niles, your Copenhagen's, and all the rest of it. And there seems to be sort of less of that. So, or even sort of not very much at all. It just sort of seems to be sort of a steady stream of service in one place, service in another place, and plenty of competence along the way. So talk us through that that process all the way up to, I guess, post captain.
mhm. So, as I said, he went off on the Worcester to Gibraltar. They did a little bit of work on convoys. He went and took his lieutenant's exam, obviously, like I said, and that exam board was made up of three captains. So, if you've seen the Fireship episode of Hornblower, you've got a good idea of the kind of the setup. And one of those was his uncle. Now, there's a myth that apparently his uncle didn't tell anyone that he was related to Nelson, but I think as soon as they looked at all of his papers, they would have very much realised that there was a tie because obviously he'd got him on his ship as a young captain servant, and that's generally the way it went. Um, so anyway, he passed his commission and he was due to head off to Jamaica on HMS Lowestoft, and they took quite a few prizes after the outbreak of the American War of Independence. And one of those was called the Little Lucy, which I think is quite nice. The chap who was in command basically had a wife called Lucy and a daughter called Lucy, and so the ship was sort of renamed after his daughter, Little Lucy. And Nelson took command of her, and it was his first kind of real command, as it were. But as I said, it did earlier, we get Nelson being a bit of a science nerd, so he gets to head off on this kind of expeditionary trip to Caicos, where they found the bird of some description. But he had a bit of an engagement, I guess, with a French frigate and a French schooner, despite Britain and France technically being at peace. But obviously, the French are very much on side with the Americans, but it doesn't really come to much again. So that's what I always sort of class as Nelson's first real engagement because he's sort of in command of a ship, as it were. Um, but yeah, it didn't really come to much. And obviously at this point, his next target is being promoted again to commando, which is kind of halfway step to post captain. And I'd said a lot of people kind of spent most of their career as a career lieutenant and then died, but if anyone was going to achieve it, it was probably going to be Nelson. And when he was in Jamaica with with the ship, one of the main toasts, you have all these naval toasts. So the famous one, of course, in Master and Commander is "Wives and Sweethearts, May they never meet," which I believe the Royal Navy have now got rid of. Um, but at the time they had quite a few on different days, and one of the main ones that the officers on the Jamaica station used to use was "A sickly season and a bloody war," because it meant engagements, it meant fighting, and it meant very, very quick promotion. And quite a lot of people were promoted very quickly whilst out in the West Indies. So then Nelson gets given a ship called the Badger, which I absolutely love. I think is a great name.
I think
Uh,
everybody wants to command HMS Badger at some point in their life, don't they?
yeah, my problem is being a millennial, my head just goes Badger, 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 which Nelson didn't
Mushroom, mushroom.
literally. So yeah,
That
he
is
had
a quote that has just aged us terribly, hasn't it?
yes. Yeah, how old are you? The Badger song.
Yeah.
So he's given Badger, and she's a Captain American ship. Uh, but they thought that it was a suitable ship for Nelson, and so subsequently, by giving him this ship and commission, it made him Master and Commander. So that meant that he could basically captain a brig or a sloop or essentially a vessel that's too small to justify an appointment of a post captain um, or a master. So kind of combined in the rank of commander, really. Um, Now, obviously, commanding a ship did again have elements of patronage, and Nelson actually was then at this point allowed to bring captain servants on board. So the circle of life had gone full loop, but he didn't really know anyone to give any helping hands to from friends or family. So he just picked out four of the guys on board that he thought were quite good, just general, able seamen, etc. And then there was one guy who he actually served with who followed Nelson from ship to ship to ship for about 16 years, which I think is quite nice. That's kind of the first point that you see people sort of following Nelson and giving him that kind of thing. Now, Nelson had a few issues when he joined the ship. They had quite a few people deserting. There were people saying he looked like a schoolboy. And you can kind of imagine it, can't you? You've got all these burly seamen who've been at sea for 30, 40, 50 years, salty and weathered. And then little Nelson pops in, like, hello. And they're probably thinking, who's this bloke? Um, but nevertheless, they all, he ended up with a full crew and they went off to Nicaragua. And actually later, Collingwood took command of the Badger. So Collingwood he was 10 years older than Nelson, but he basically followed Nelson all the way through, picking up each post that Nelson had then got out of. So the Badger, Hinchinbrook, etc. Like Nelson went through it and left, and then Collingwood went through or pretty much the exact same path, which I think is quite nice because it also means that they had similar understandings, similar crews, dealt with similar issues, I think, probably in their sort of younger command positions. And then Nelson's given command of HMS Hinchinbrook, which is a frigate, which is where we want to be, far more exciting. And they headed off to help, what's his name? Darling. Major General, Lieutenant General, Major General Darling. I'm not very good with army things, sorry. And they were trying to basically capture the Spanish colonies, including a fort on the San Juan River. So there's a really, really famous painting of Nelson looking like when he's quite young. And you can see a fort in the background, and that's the San Juan fort that he specifically asked to be painted in the background of that picture. And essentially they were sort of escorting troops. And Nelson had been there quite a lot of time at this point in time. He'd served there previously, and he's now post captain. So he's actually the highest ranking kind of naval officer on the expedition, but his authority is very much kind of confined to the sea. So he didn't really have much to do once the army had disembarked. I think there's a really funny story about one of the army officers saying that a light-haired boy came to me in a little frigate. And he didn't really seem of much consequence, but then he sort of took over everything. But yeah, everyone started getting really ill. It was I got malaria, typhoid, dysentery, all of the trifecta of lovely things that you might want to get while you're away at sea. And Nelson was one of the first to get it, and he was really, really ill. So he went on to a different ship, and Collingwood then took command of the Hinchinbrook, and Nelson went ashore. because he wasn't very well. I can't remember where he went because I don't know. I can't remember where he went, but he was ashore for a really long time, basically being looked after Cornwallis's, I guess, staff, who made him get a little bit better. And then he was given another ship, HMS Albemarle, which kind of spanned the last 2, 3 years of the American Wars of Independence. Of course, France and Spain had decided to join in attacking us at that point. Um, but Nelson was obviously, relatively experienced, doing lots of networking. And I think actually what is interesting with this is that when the Albemarle went into New York, Nelson went on board the Barfleur to speak to the crew, and he met a young midshipman who was actually Prince William Henry. Um, so he was, I don't know, the third son of the king at the point. So he joined the Navy when he was 13, so he's quite young at this point. Um, and obviously Nelson was quite a royalist, so he sort of took to him and kept an eye on him throughout the next few years. And I'll come back to him a bit later, probably, because inevitably he will pop up again. But I think he basically said that Nelson was a boy of a captain with a lank ponytail. So all of these descriptions of Nelson aren't going with the stout, athletic one that the other chap said, but he sort of, I think Nelson realized that the prince was very much into the Navy. He wanted to learn, he wanted to work, he was dedicated to actually being in the Navy. And Nelson obviously was very, very similar. So I think um, that's what he liked. So he wanted to help him out a little bit.
Oh God, so many rabbit holes.
So many rabbit holes.
Let's stay with the patron side of things. How much is this sort of jumping from ship to ship related to patronage, and how much of it is that kind of slightly remarkable thing that you just mentioned there, which is this is still American War of Independence. Like his career is well on its way, long before anybody's talking about a certain Bonaparte, anybody's talking about certainly a Wellesley, or maybe less so a Blucher, but Blucher takes a long time to blossom. Like he's well on his way very early on, and how much of that is opportunity created by the American War of Independence versus patronage?
Yeah, so I think it's a bit of both, really. But a lot of it does come down to patronage. So Nelson, the captain of HMS Lowestoft, a guy called William Locker, was very, very impressed with Nelson when he went on board. And I think it's important to actually note who Locker was, because Nelson kind of became his best friend in a sense, and a bit of a confidant, because he realized Nelson was dedicated to the Navy. He wanted to be in the Navy. And Locker and Nelson would speak to each other all the time. They wrote letters. And obviously Nelson reacted very well to people giving him praise, which Locker used to do regularly. Um, and Nelson also is very, very good at making friends with people that he admired. So throughout his entire career, he is talking to people that he admires. He's trying to network. He's trying to make the most of those connections. And he does it basically for, like I said, the entirety of his career. There's a really good story after the Nile where he wrote to Locker telling him a story about when they'd served together. And he'd said that after, I don't know, however many years it was that we've known each other, nothing will change my attachment and my gratitude to you. You taught me how to board a Frenchman. You taught me keep a Frenchman close and you'll beat him. And Nelson said that their friendship wouldn't ever end until he died. And that's how close they were. They were very, very close. Actually, they referred to him as Nelson's sea daddy, um, because he was really a great mentor to Nelson. He very much wore his heart on his sleeve, I think, in terms of his emotions. When you read his letters, if he thought well of you, then he would tell you. If he didn't like you, he would also tell you. But I think it was the kind of friendship that he had with William Locker that kind of was his greatest benefit. Obviously, he had his uncle, but he did a lot more. And when he came back from Nicaragua, he was writing letters regularly because he wanted to get to sea again. And Nelson's in Bath, taking the waters and trying to get better. And Locker would send him news from London and chat to people. And then whenever Nelson met people in Bath, he would mention that he knew William Locker as a kind of a name drop. look who I know, look who I'm friends with. Oh yes, this is my mentor, and it kind of gave him a bit of credibility. And again, it was networking. Nelson loved a name drop. Um, and that painting that I was saying about where they put the San Juan fort in the background, Locker was dealing with all of Nelson's stuff that was going on in London. So there were some paintings that had been done and they wanted him to be a captain now rather than a lieutenant. So they changed the painting. So if you were to look underneath that famous painting, you would see a different uniform, but it was all kind of painted over. And then the fort was added in the background. Um, and I think also probably worth remembering is Nelson's connections with Hood. So it wasn't really a patronage thing in the sense that he'd worked with him for a really long time. They wrote hundreds of letters to each other. But Hood was really impressed with Nelson and well thought of, meaning that he then got referred off to given another ship, and he was kind of told who he should bring on board by Hood. So he ended up with a lot of favourites on board of people like Howe and Hood and Sir John Jervis and Cornwallis. So when Nelson was eventually given that ship, it was quite a bunch of young guys who'd got a little bit of experience, but mostly knew the right people. And I think that you can see that throughout the Navy at the time, with most of the sort of names that have managed to do anything of note. If you look back at their connections and how they got into the Navy, I mean, Thomas Hardy is another example. He went off to sea when he was young with a family friend who lived in Burton Bradstock just down the road. So very much not who you knew, but to some extent, yeah, who you knew.
Fair enough. And what do we know about his style as a captain? Because we've talked about sort of indications that Nelson might have been popular and sort of um, that the example of the guy who sort of follows him from ship to ship for 16 years. I'm guessing because he's not pulled up on it, he's a reasonably attentive captain. But do we have a strong sense of characteristics and style as a commander?
Yeah, I mean, people thought quite well of him. So there's a really interesting story when he gets put in command of a ship called the Janus. I'm going to say Janus. Uh, and Nelson's still really unwell. So the ship ends up in harbour, and a lot of the men are obviously trying to desert or getting drunk and causing problems. And Nelson very much kind of gave people, so, well, the sentences that people were given differed based on the kind of degree of guilt. I mean, you've done a lot of work on court martials and things, so you know discipline is very much your thing. But there was a lot of examples of Nelson um, kind of looking at whether someone has sort of stitched somebody else up and whether that person should get more lashes than the person who was actually in trouble because this had happened. He was very much wanting to see what had happened. And I don't know that he was actually supervising the floggings because he was really unwell and he probably spent most of his time with the surgeon, honestly. But he did have quite a lot of respect from most of the men who served with him. He referred to a lot of them as good fellows. And actually, at one point when he was transferring to another ship, a lot of the crew said actually that they would then enter their names in the ship's book immediately because they wanted to go with him. And as I said, the young boys, when he was appointed to the Boreas, were all fairly young, and he was trying to impress upon them that kind of idea of duty and hard work and introducing them to people because they didn't have that many people to look up to apart from him, I think is how he kind of saw it. And I think he understood the value of connections and wanted to help them in the same way that he'd been helped, I guess. Some nice stories of people actually wanting to follow him and wanting to serve with him, even at this point in time in what 1780s, which is a long time before we get to the point where everyone's crying about the death of Nelson and how much they loved him. So it's not something that just kind of happens overnight for him.
There is a slightly crazy thought, though, which is that come the 1780s, we know that he's only 20 years out
Hmm.
from his death, give or take a little bit. Um, we're going to go there with that most controversial of topics. There are, of course, other controversies that we'll get to in due course. And the one that I'm really thinking about here is slavery.
Mhm.
Um, what is the deal here? His wife, we'll talk about her in just a moment, but his wife had slavery connections. Did Nelson own slaves? I guess is the first place to go with this.
He didn't. So I think probably best place to start is talking about why Nelson's actually in the Caribbean to begin with. So he gets sent across to um, English Harbour in Antigua on the Boreas, and his goal is essentially to enforce the Navigation Acts. So for those who aren't aware of the Navigation Acts, essentially that it's to do with trade, it's to do with British goods on British ships with British crews, etc., etc. Nelson hated Antigua. He actually, I mean, he was there during hurricane season, and he referred to it as a infernal hole and a vile place. And people now go there on holiday, which I think is English Harbour is now Nelson's dockyard, and um, I don't think he enjoyed it very much, and it probably was disgusting with all the ship holed up there, dumping everything into a very small area. But essentially, there was a problem with these American ships trading, and this included in St. Kitts and in Nevis, and they were trading illegally. They'd say they needed to go into port because they had broken ships and holes and masts, and then they'd make fake papers and basically pretend that they were British and try to flog their cargo to pay for their repairs. Um, and there are a few officers who kind of said, well, we can ignore it because there was some government corruption. And Nelson was very much of the opinion, much like his walk to school in the snow, that that's not my job. I'm here to do this. And he upset quite a few people. There's a story that supposedly he forced some, well, essentially he did force some masters into depositions. They said it was false, with his officers basically holding a sword to their heads. And so they basically sued him, I guess, for some compensation, which meant that they had a trial in Nevis, and a few people were kind of helping out Nelson. They offered to pay his bail and things. And he went for a dinner when he was in Nevis, and met up with Francis Nisbet's uncle, anyway. And he was introduced to Frances Nisbet, who was a 24-year-old widow who met Nelson for the first time. Um, and essentially, she did have, or her father did own slaves. So that's where that does come from. She had a not well, she didn't call him a slave, she called him a manservant. Um, but yeah, essentially, her family did have slaves and colonial kind of um, connections, and pretty much everyone in Nevis did. It was sugar, but yeah, so that's where that essentially came from. He was spending a lot of time at dinners with people who, you know, owned slaves, because that was the fact of the matter. They all owned plantations, etc. At that point in time. And one of his friends over in the West Indies was a guy called Simon Taylor, who owned a lot of slaves in Jamaica. And he Nelson had met him, I don't know, a few years before. Um, and that's where the letter that we should probably mention comes into it.
Yeah, that's exactly where I was going to go next because so far this feels relatively, well, in fact, really quite innocuous in the grand scheme of things because we're not describing somebody here who is a slave owner. We're
Mhm.
describing somebody here who married into a slave owning family. But I mean, maybe there's a sort of whole inheritance thing that we haven't got to yet. But the letter it tends to be the big one, right? Published in 1807, i.e., posthumous, supposedly written by him and claiming to support slavery. But I gather there are questions over the authenticity. Talk me through it.
Yeah, so there is a letter basically, as you said, written, published in 1807, which is 2 years after Nelson. It was written to Simon Taylor, the guy that I said about a minute ago. Um, and he was a friend of Nelson's. He was a plantation owner, he owned slaves, and supposedly the content in the letter says that Nelson was racist, he was pro-slavery, but a few people from I can't remember who it is, one of the historical organizations basically did some research and found out that the letter was actually embellished and tampered with by the anti-abolitionist, can't even say it, anti-abolitionist movement, after Nelson had died, basically to try and use his fame and his reputation to kind of influence those debates that were going on in Parliament about abolition of the slave trade. They didn't want it to be abolished. Um, and the people that did this research essentially found that there are 25 changes and additions compared to an original that was found. So, as you said, the letter was published after Nelson died. It's not in his handwriting, and it's a really dodgy signature as well. But when they found a sort of copy of the original letter that Nelson had written to Simon Taylor about slavery, sort of. So Taylor had written to Nelson asking that he would basically intervene in the abolition debate, and Nelson went back with a fairly diplomatic response. But the letter that was published in 1807 essentially, I don't know the best way of putting it. The way that Nelson was putting it was that he supported the colonial kind of system, which I guess you can say is supporting the slave trade sort of by default. But actually, when you look into the changes that have been made to that letter, they are quite significant. It's not Nelson's handwriting, and you can very clearly see the aim to kind of change the context of it. But there's a whole article, I think it's a full journal article that these people have written looking into the differences. And I mean, the best way of thinking about whether Nelson supported slavery, I guess, is to look at how people were treated in the Royal Navy. So people that escaped to join the Royal Navy, slaves that escaped and joined the Royal Navy were signed on, they were paid, and they were discharged as free men. There's a guy on, oh, which column is it? Trafalgar, I think. The column on the plaque that shows Trafalgar on Nelson's column, you can see um, a chap on the left-hand side who's one of the black seamen who had joined the Navy, shooting the French, which I think is always quite nice. But there are numerous examples of Nelson basically trying to help people and freeing people. He actually had a manservant who they freed, and then he actually said he wanted to stay with Nelson. And Nelson said that um, Emma could have him live with her, but the guy basically said no. Maybe he'd learned at this point that he didn't want to live with Nelson and Emma, but they freed him anyway. So I I don't know. It depends how you want to look at it. A lot of people will take it in different contexts because of just the time that it was written, but you also can't dispute the fact that those changes were made to the letter um, to make it more anti-abolition than it was.
So what we're talking about here is a connection by marriage to a slave owning family that
Yeah.
he doesn't inherit. Is that right? So,
No, so they Francis Nisbet and Nelson actually, move back over to Britain and don't go back to Nevis at all.
okay. So there's a plantation family connection by marriage,
Yeah.
i.e., not directly involved. There's a letter which you could construe as support for the wider economic system within the West Indies, which would be fairly typical of the time. But then there's a subsequent version that's definitely been doctored and changed in multiple ways to make it seem much more pro-slavery for a political agenda after his death when he can't speak out and say that's not me.
Mhm.
Is there anything else to this argument, or is it genuinely this forgery letter and the marriage connection that seems to be the core of the debate on this?
As far as I'm aware, that's pretty much it. That the letter, the marriage, and obviously the fact that um, Nelson did have a servant at one point, but again, he'd already been freed and was offered the option to stay and didn't.
Okay. Um, Curious that that's the limit of it. Did this blow up because of the timing? Because we're a lot of this hit the headlines, didn't it, around the Black Lives Matter protests? Was this a kind of a something that just sort of hit the popular knowledge at the wrong moment, or was this already common knowledge and then just kind of people re put it into the public mainstream and then sort of it exploded from there?
I can't even remember when it came out now. It was about a year ago, wasn't it?
It would have been, from what I remember, it was around the lockdown,
Lockdown kind of
which
time,
would have
yeah.
been, blimey, 3 years now.
Oh, I can't even remember. Yeah, I can't remember when it was now. But I think the Daily Mail probably had a lot to do with it. But I think the the guy that did the research came from the Nelson Society. I think he was the chair of the Nelson Society. So you can possibly look at there being maybe a bit of bias there, but equally they went and did their research properly. They've gone into archive documents and they've compared everything, and you can quite clearly see the differences. Do you know what I mean? You're not just that he's not just going to say stuff for the sake of it because people would shoot him down. Um, and he basically went on a letter that he'd seen in an auction catalogue from Nelson, I think, and then went back and was like, "Oh, hang on a minute, that was um, it doesn't really look like Nelson's right." And I mean, the Nelson Society spend a lot of time looking at Nelson. There's actually a documentary I think they made about it called Nelson and the Slave Trade. It's on Amazon. I don't know if it's still on Amazon. Um, but I do remember watching that at the time, and they did look at the letter. I think the main thing to think about that if Nelson's letter had showed support for slavery, they wouldn't have to have changed it. If
Hmm.
it was directly supporting slavery, they wouldn't have had to forge it. They wouldn't have had to add parts in, and they wouldn't have had to send it to people. They wouldn't have had to change anything because it would have been very glaringly obvious what he meant, I think. But obviously Nelson wasn't around to to put his little spin on that. But I think it's one of those things, isn't it? I'm surprised it took so long for people to make a comment on it, but equally, when you look into the reasons for it, I think a lot of the context has been removed, which is the main issue.
Okay, let's move on to talk about his marriage, which goes on to become a controversial topic, but isn't, as far as I'm aware, initially. Um, Tell us about Frances Nesbit. Well, we've covered where she comes from already, but what's she like as a person? And initially, is this a happy enough marriage?
Yeah, so her father had been a judge on Nevis. As I said, she did have a black servant, and so she obviously grew up in that kind of environment. It probably wasn't that strange to her because that was, the environment in which she'd grown up in. She was widowed very young, and she was only 24 when Nelson met her, but she already had a son and was widowed by 24, which I always think is very sad. Um, and Herbert, that was his name, Herbert, who was the councillor of Nevis. That's how he met Francis Nisbet. So he actually had slaves. He worked in sugar. Nelson spent a lot of time with him. He was the person that actually offered to give Nelson bail if the grumpy merchant ships decided to take it. So there were all of these kind of interactions with Nelson, with these people, but he never directly engaged in it in that sense, if you know what I mean. Now, Frances was fairly intelligent. She spoke French. She worked as an interpreter for her uncle when diplomats visited. She was very good at writing, but a lot of people said she was quite plain and sensible. I think there was one of Nelson's midshipmen who said that she was distinctly unremarkable when it came to her intellect, which I think is very unfair because she seemed to be quite a nice person. She went on in later life to look after Nelson's father basically until he died. Like she was obviously a very caring person. She wrote a lot of letters to Nelson. And her stepson went off to sea with Nelson. There's that patronage thing coming all around again. But their marriage was pretty happy to begin with. Yeah, they wrote some really nice letters to each other. He said that his heart was filled with the purest and most tender affection. He was very, as I said, Nelson was very good at covering his emotions when he wanted to. Um, she also wasn't too happy about him heading off to sea quite regularly, and he famously said that duty is the great business of a sea officer, and that all private considerations had to give way to it. Um, which I think is basically just get over it. I'm going to sea. catching
He
a bit.
likes flowery language, doesn't he? Like he doesn't state things simply. Like everything has a
Everything is
flourish to it.
very quotable. But yeah, so he wasn't having a great time out there. He had to convene a court martial against the prince, who had actually been a witness at his wedding to Francis Nisbet Fanny. Um, so they're quite good friends at this point in time. He'd had to chaperone him and all sorts, but he had to convene a court martial against the prince for a neglect of duty charge, and he dismissed it when he was head of the court martial and just went, "No, we're just gonna push that one to one side." He also had obviously upset everybody uh, with the corruption and things. The Admiralty weren't very happy about it. And then he also got in trouble for sanctioning the release of a guy from, I can't remember his name, from HMS Rattler. And he'd basically been sentenced to death by court martial for desertion. And Nelson said no. And that kind of, they decided that went well beyond his authority. And he shouldn't have done that. So he ended up heading back to England with Frances and her son Josiah. And basically, yeah, she looked after Nelson's father while he was at sea. And for the rest of her life, she was a very devoted wife, even after everything that happens in the future with Emma Hamilton, spoiler alert. Um, she still very much did care about him. Um, it's quite sad, really, how she ended up being treated. But by all accounts, she was a nice person. She's buried in Exmouth in Devon. You can go and see her grave just outside Exmouth. I can't remember the name of the village, but I went there a couple of years ago.
Okay. So can we just pause a moment to acknowledge the fact that I haven't gone down either an NRWGC rabbit hole or a crime and punishment rabbit hole, and I have stayed resolutely
The grave
on
actually could
topic.
do with tidying up if you wanted to go down that rabbit hole.
I think we'll save that for an off-air discussion. So let's start to sort of wrap up this first chapter of his life. By the late 1780s, the war with America is obviously long since over. He's had a little bit of controversy and had to go back to the UK, well, Britain. The UK doesn't exist at this point in time. Um, is his career in danger of stalling at this point? Why isn't he getting sort of the opportunities he wants? And is it just that simple thing that during times of peace, there aren't enough ships at sea versus the number of captains? Or is this that actually, he's done well, but he hasn't done anything that flashy? And there are other people more senior in the lists with perhaps better connections that mean that he's just not going to get the chance unless another war comes knocking.
I mean, I think you can easily say that a lot of it comes down to the fact that the Admiralty were still very angry with him, and what he'd got up to in the West Indies after he got back. He didn't work for 5, 6 years afterwards. After he got back, he was yeah. So he didn't go to sea for 5 or 6 years. He wrote a lot of letters, um, trying to get another job and didn't didn't get it. So he said that there was a prejudice against him at the Admiralty, but he couldn't account for what it might be. But I suspect it probably was to do with the Navigation Act enforcement, honestly. Um, Thankfully for Nelson, obviously in 1793, war broke out with France, so he was pretty much destined to have another job at that point. But yeah, I think the Admiralty were pretty unhappy with what he'd got up to in the West Indies, which is why he went home. And the point was made to him.
Okay, so there we have the early phase of Nelson's career. Folks, obviously, we're not leaving it there, but we will call a halt for this session. Kate, an absolute joy to speak to you once again. Thank you for taking us through Nelson's life in so much more detail than we have done previously on this show. And I know the listeners will look forward to joining you for another installment in the not too distant future.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's been fun rambling about Nelson. There's
This
so
is
much. The trouble is, there's so much you could say. You could do a whole hour just talking about when he was in the West Indies, It's so difficult to cover everything that he got up to because it's not the most exciting period of his career in the sense of huge battles, but it's very much set all of the foundations for those battles. And I think that's kind of why you have to really look at what he was getting up to before we get to that stage.
Well, more famous stuff for people to dig their teeth into in due course. Folks, this has been the Napoleonic Wars pod. We will be back very soon. Folks, as the festive season approaches, consider whether you'd be willing to do any of these things to spread the Napoleonic cheer. Love the show? Never want to miss the latest news? Then sign up to our newsletter by contacting us at napwarspod@gmail.com and get the regular Napoleonic bulletins direct to your inbox. Looking for a novel Christmas gift for the Napoleonicist in your life? Check out our merch via the link in the description in order to support our work while giving your loved ones something distinctive this winter. If you aren't in a position where you can dig into your pockets, then believe me, we totally get it. But that doesn't mean that you can't thank us for the episodes that you've enjoyed in a different way. All podcast platforms have ways for you to leave your reviews, so just spare us 2 minutes and leave a review wherever you listen to us. It makes a world of difference in boosting our international ranking and widening our reach. Much love to all our Patreon supporters who are enjoying a rejuvenated and revitalized offering of perks on Patreon. Head to patreon.com/the Napoleonic Wars pod to find out how you can join a buzzing community of like-minded Napoleonic nerds who are enjoying things like courses, socials, a book club, green room access to recordings, early releases, exclusive episodes, and much more besides. Their support is empowering us to triple our output and develop new exciting documentary channels. So if you want to be kept entertained on a daily basis when it comes to Napoleonic nerdery, prices start from just £2 a month. And you can, if you can spare the cost of a cup of coffee each month to support us, it would mean a huge amount. Shout outs to our patrons who, at the time of recording in late October, are in the mentioned in dispatches tier: Rob Griffith, Brendan Teeling, Beatrice de Graaf, Lynn Dawson, Jamie Kingston, Jim Deary, Josh Keeney, Colin Fieldhouse, Stephen Colson, Jim Getz, Stephen Gillen, Hugh Brennan, Alistair Campbell-Grieve, Andy Meakin, Mark Anscombe, Rob Coughlin, Bruins Girl, Noah Fink, Mark Trowbridge, Miles Reedy, Nick Overland, Graham Goodwin, Chris Pramus, Anthony Gumbau, Anonymous American, Martin Pisani, James Fluick, Natasha Hobday, Rod Schwager, Chris Kimball, Gary Dennis, Ted Andrews, Richard Anderson, Arthur Forgy, Sam Moore, Wyatt Pollock, Carol Dixon Smith, Roland Shark, Giovanni, Jean-Baptiste Van Merlen, Darla Vincent, Brendan Hogan, Peter Findlay, Jeff Maple, Ian Harding, Indiana Fats, and Joe Ayres. The Admirals: Mark Chestnut, John Haynes, Mike Guest, Rachel Stark, Mark Duckers, David Priest, David Maxwell, Graham Callister, Sean Sullivan, Stephen Ashworth, Dan Hazelwood, Kate Walcombe, Clemens Beman, Charles McKay, Reto the Sci-Fi Fan, Tim Day, Jason Morn, Tim Pritchard, and the enigmatically named Zed. The Chiefs of Staff: that's Adam Coslin, the Marshals, Ryan Diamond and JC Kaiser, the Legion de Scholars, Dan Hazelwood and Bob Burnham, and in the Crown Yourself tier, Emperor of the First French Empire, Todd Campbell, and the Duke of Wellington, Laird Campbell. We'll be back very soon, but until then, this has been the Napoleonic Wars pod. On behalf of myself, Liam, Luke, and Josh, take care of yourselves, folks, stay well, and as always, thank you for listening.